Thank you. I want to say that we changed up a little bit that chant, but it's from the Venezuelan movements. It goes a little different, but we wanted to connect it to the liberation of Palestine. So hi everyone. Again, my name is Kitzia Esteva. I'm the Grassroots Feminisms organizer at the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. I use they pronouns. I come from the San Francisco Bay Area by way of Mexico City, by way of Zapotec ancestors. And yeah, I am so excited and really feeling the honor of being in this conversation with our comrades, with lovely, super badass, intelligent, incredible organizers. And I wanna also shout out some of the other organizations from the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance that are here. Just because part of the work that we're doing through this summit is to really connect the voices and leadership of grassroots movements to this movement for feminist peace. And so there's comrades from women working together, from About Face veterans against Iraq veterans against the war. Equality Labs, you might get a chance to be in a breakout later on with them. Who am I missing, Ramon? Huh? A-Rock, that's right. A-Rock, our beloved Lara, who was here earlier on the podium. And then Courage and Sue, who are in the podium too. So I'm gonna start just by introducing the amazing organizers here. I have some theoretical and semi-theoretical questions, but I also ask my comrades to focus on storytelling and just giving the vibe and the drumbeat of community organizing and transformative organizing. So we'll take it in an organic way. Those questions are there just for guidance. So we have Janene Yazzie. She, her, is an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. She has over 12 years of experience as a community organizer and human rights advocate. Deeply rooted in local community issues. She's the director of policy and advocacy at NDN Collective, beginning from her community, Siani, I hope I said that right, in Dine. She has worked on the intersections of climate change, water security, food security, energy development, and nation building with indigenous communities and indigenous-led organizations in the US, Canada, and Latin America. Yes, let's clap it up for Janene. Thank you. Next, we have Nana Gyamfi. Nana is the executive director of Black Alliance for Just Immigration, BAJI, a national organization that fights for the rights of Black migrants and African Americans through organizing, legal advocacy, research, policy, and narrative building to improve the conditions of Black communities by advancing racial justice and migrant rights. She's a movement attorney for over 25 years. Nana is the co-founder of Justice Warriors for Black Lives and human rights advocacy organizations dedicated to fight for human rights and Black liberation. She's a former professor in the Pan-African Studies Department at California State, Los Angeles, and the former president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, NCBL, an international women's rights organization, and the Ford Foundation as both the senior advisor and global strategy and representative for South Asia, and as president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women. Yes, what a trajectory, right? Then we have Diana Lopez. Diana Lopez is a Chicana born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, with deep ties with the Rio Bravo border. Her work with Southwest Workers Union, Centro por la Justicia, involves linking issues around environmental justice, living wage, and accountable governance. Centro Su works to reframe public policy to protect the community and include the voices of local residents. It has led to successful strategic campaigns targeting wages, military environmental cleanup, economic revitalization, healthcare, and energy policy. Diana is currently in her 8th year as the executive director at SWU. Under her direction, the organization has grown in impact, fundraising, and membership base, and features a femme of color leadership body. Diana has worked to transition the 35-year-plus organization utilizing civic engagement techniques for issues-based organizing to scale SWU's impact and direct reach community residents. And she's most excited about community development project, renovating the property into a movement center and resilience hub at SWU. She's the mother of 2 wild wolves. Loves to read, is a sticker fanatic, and I got some stickers for you. And has a deep appreciation for being in the outdoors. And you'll see Ezra, the little one, with that's around with her. Thank you for having your baby with us. Yeah. And last, absolutely not least, the fabulous Xochitl Larios is the youth justice coordinator at Courage. She cut her teeth in community organizing, youth leadership, and activism as a program participant while incarcerated in juvenile hall. At Courage, Xochitl brought her innovative youth transformative curriculum to detained youth and led participatory research, culminating in the 2019 report, Dream Beyond Bars, a youth vision for Alameda County juvenile justice system. Look it up at the Courage website, it's brilliant. Xochitl received her associate in social sciences from Laney College, where she's honored as a Chicana graduate of Restoring Our Communities and Raíces Students Network. She's a 2018 recipient of the California Endowment Community Champion Youth Award. She also serves as a commissioner on the Alameda County Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Commission, ensuring youth voices are heard in policymaking. Xochitl works in the trenches of grassroots mobilization and relentless advocates for youth representation at a local and state policy initiatives in California. So what is this panel about? Anti-militarism grassroots organizing by communities of color, a feminist response to entanglement of militarism. I think, first of all, the request earlier from one of our comrades to talk about militarism at home, not as like a separate thing from militarism abroad, right? That is actually, the entanglement and connection is deep, and it's in many ways the same forces, in many ways synchronized. And so we want to talk about how communities of color are organizing in this the belly of the beast with our comrades here on the stage. So we seek in this panel to reject this false binary of the war at home and the war abroad as separate phenomena, and that we know that state violence, communities of color and indigenous communities experience in the US is wholly intertwined with the US imperialist machine and the wars of aggression that we see in the rest of the world. And we will be talking about defunding the military, police, jails, and detention centers, and closing the US military's massive network around the world and in communities of color in the US. And how we reprioritize economy to one of care and resilience, not war and death. So big questions, and organizing has some of the answers, and the active work of organizing. It's really about the practice of how we build those communities of care that we need to have for our communities to thrive. So with that being said, the first question, tell us about your work. How do you address militarized violence in your work? What are the connections between the militarized violence you see in the communities you organize and militarism abroad? And what are some practices of internationalism that your organizing work do? Which I'm sure there's plenty. And just to say, one thing I did ask our panelists is to ask questions of each other and bounce off of each other. So we'll see what happens. Not all my questions will get answered, but we'll get a lot of really awesome stories. Should we start with you, Janene?
Sure.
Oh, actually, you said you wanted to wait.
That's okay. We can
Okay. All right.
We can switch it up.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you for that very intense question. Yate everyone again, Shea, Janene, Yazzie, and Shea. And so, as concisely as possible, knowing that I'm not going to be able to have enough time to really cover the whole of the complexities around this. Indian Collective, one of the primary roles we find ourselves doing in advocating and working to support the self-determination of indigenous peoples is this ongoing labor to combat the erasure and the invisibility of indigenous peoples, or the addition of indigenous peoples as an afterthought or an addendum to movement strategy and social justice movements. Because we know that this has lent itself historically and even now to the development of an incomplete political analysis that is a detriment to our movements. Because the institutions and questions, everything that we're talking about and the systems of power that we are confronting, we're literally, I mean, through our lived experience and through what we've witnessed, were built to facilitate, legalize, and otherwise normalize the genocide of indigenous peoples and the theft and exploitation of our lands and our sacred places. And in that process, there was never and has never been a distinction between police forces and the military. They have always been one and the same. And so from that lens, we understand that we are not right now experiencing a crisis of democracy. We have never had a democracy. The exclusion of women, the treatment of our relatives of African descent, and the privileging of wealth holders over the people were literally built into the design of what we understand and see and experience as the US government. And that's why it has been such a formidable machine of imperialism here and globally. And so, our experiences and our social, political, and cultural memory is important, and what we're always consistently trying to offer, and why at Indian Collective we structured ourselves to be a movement organization, to combat all of the ways that indigenous peoples have been tokenized, our fights either invisibilized or co-opted, even by well-meaning allies and organizations. Because we know all of the work that indigenous peoples do is to combat those systems of imperialism and the use of police and state institutions to protect white supremacists and facilitating settler colonialism. And so we do this work based on 3 pillars: to defend, develop, and decolonize. We have seen that that has been the effective way to recapture and rematriate resources to our movements on the ground, to the communities themselves that have been in the forefront of building solutions, and why we are so unapologetic in our tactics to uphold the need to support the self-determination of Indigenous peoples and the rights of Indigenous peoples. In that lens, we know that our liberation is intertwined with everyone else, that we can't be free unless we're all free, that there is an offering and a gift in our movement for land back that helps us facilitate that liberation and become a part of that liberation for all peoples, because we know these linkages come from understanding that the root causes of our injustices now is colonization and white supremacy. And even if we have different experiences of that based on our populations, the people's communities that we come from, that the conditions that it's created are the same among all of our communities. And I know we'll go more into that as we move forward, but I'll just start there.
All right, thank you. Are we going down the line? Yes. Okay. Greetings, everyone. Very glad to be here. Hopefully you can hear me through this mask. I'll try to be semi-loud here. And I'm going to offer my comments today in honor of Carl Hamad Lipscomb, who we just recently lost, former longtime deputy director, always forever comrade of Baji, who really, in the moments particularly around 2010, 2011, 2012, in that push towards what would become the movement for Black Lives and the Black Lives Matter movement, really talked about this intersection of Black migrants and criminalization in a way that a lot of folks were trying to avoid. Because, we migrants, we don't commit crimes. We don't go to jail. We just work and become doctors and lawyers, right? And so really being willing to speak up about that and to talk about what is happening in terms of militarization and policing in the context of migration, both as a root cause and as what we are subjected to on our ways here and while we are here, and seeing that as a continual line. And so again, the domestic foreign policy and the foreign policy not being different. And in fact, I don't know, I'm sure some folks know this here, but in the US government, immigration falls under foreign policy when they want to do strategy. They do not talk about it under domestic policy. They only talk about it under domestic policy when they want to play with you in your face. But when they're really talking seriously, you're now talking to the foreign, quote unquote, foreign policy people. So they know, to the point made earlier this morning, that there is no difference for them, right? And so for us at Baji, really, we're an abolitionist organization. We proudly describe ourselves that in the midst of an immigrant rights movement that does not necessarily do so, because we see that policing and militarization are the same thing. Talking about stories, there's 2 things that come to my brain when I think about those connections. I think about the calls that we were getting from our East African comrades, particularly from Somalia, but even from Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, during the 2020 rebellions from Minneapolis, right, from the center, right there where George Floyd had been murdered. That area is a very East African migrant area, right? And it just, the force that the police used, the ways in which the police came in, the military equipment that the police have, the surveillance equipment that the police have. These were people, particularly those who are Muslim, who had already been dealing with and already have had the conflict with the militarized borders as they come into this country, even when they're coming just to visit, right? And had dealt with the militarization that had happened in their countries as a result of US policies, where their countries were being bombed, where their countries were being destroyed, where monies and military armaments from the United States were being sent to their countries for people to use against people. And then to come and to be in Minneapolis and to experience that same trauma, right, was something that, you know, in this country we talk about fireworks and how fireworks are disturbing to veterans. There are other folks that are veterans that don't get that same kind of, you know, love and concern from the government, who also are used to the sounds of bombs and have, you know, heard the sounds of rifles and know the sounds of death that have been brought by this country. And then when they come into this country, they experience that again under the hands of policing. So I think of them, and then I think of one of our staff members in particular from Haiti, who came here as a young boy, who talks about fleeing Haiti and the reasons that they had to flee Haiti. Again, the root causes and the violence that emanates from the West, and then coming and watching people in his family and his community disappear through the violence of ICE enforcement as a result of the 1994 and 1996 crime bills and immigration bill that basically resulted in over 75% of Black migrants who are deported being deported on criminal grounds. And he's come to Baji recently and was like, wow, looking at these reports, seeing what I'm seeing, now I can connect it to what I was experiencing and actually living. And then we think about how Haitians are being deported and removed right now, even as the United States is getting its people out, right? And the violence of being, you know, they act like they just buy you a ticket and then you're sitting there and they give you a Coke and ask you if you, you know, pay $8, you can get a harder drink. Folks are shackled. Folks are handcuffed. In some cases, they have hoods over their heads. They're in the wrap, right? And those things then become the same tactics that are used in the criminal sanction system and the same tactics that are used to kidnap our people and assassinate our leaders, et cetera, in the countries that we are coming from, right? And so for us, there is no separation. We see how the same tools are used. We see that it's the same violence. We see that it's the same systems. And so we work within the diaspora to remind our people that just because the police is, you know, the United States police, that didn't make it any better than the Nigerian SARS police, right, or the police in Ghana or the police in Brazil, and that the militarism that they experience and that we experience in our countries, that this is the same country engaged in that militarism. And therefore, in the belly of the beast, we do not just for our folks here, but also for our folks back home by making sure that beast is slain. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Buenas tardes. Can you hear me? Woohoo! All right. Step one, turn on your mic. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everybody. In hearing some of these conversations, they get you in deep thought, right? I come from San Antonio, Texas, by way of the Rio Grande, the Rio Bravo, as we know it. And it's interesting to hear a lot of these conversations around how violence plays out, because we have to really think about how our state and our communities were created in the first place. I think about what's happening right now in universities in Texas and then what's also happening on the border. And the reality that there's both military presence as well as state troopers enforcing the peace of a certain majority, a certain minority group who is in control of power in Texas, right? And so we think about sort of the way things progress. We talked about the Texas Rangers, Los Rinches, the way we knew them as basically for us, they were the bad guys, right? They were our assassins. They were the police enforcing the law of Anglo settlers in Texas. And so we see that hundreds of years after, 300 plus years, still the same system of colonization, of enforcement, of violence, but it's just as technology and as narratives have an evolution, so does those systems, right? And I think we have to really think about sort of the systemic and the structural pieces. It's all connected, right? One of our biggest, I come from an organization called Southwest Workers Union, and we used to be a school worker union and then kind of generalized into general workers. All of our members work to meet their basic needs, and sometimes that's not even enough. So when we talk about community, when we talk about safe spaces, when we talk about creating community development spaces, those are needed. Because that's been our vision, right? We come from an environmental justice space where we envision something different, but oftentimes we don't get to really realize that vision, right? So our predecessors were a really older organization, and at a certain point, people were tired of just fighting the bad stuff, fighting the contamination on the ground, fighting against all these different systems and structures, right? And that got them really tired, and so we needed to really pivot our movement to create some of that good, the visioning pieces, right? The good things, model the good things. And they would always say, well, we don't know how that looks. We have to make an assessment. We have to figure out what the budget looks like for that, ¿verdad? So for us, we were like, well, we're gonna fundraise on our own. We're gonna grassroots fundraise. We're gonna create membership dues. We're gonna do these systems that we've been dreaming about because for decades we've been asking for them. And they haven't made it possible, right? So we not only have to be in the policy spaces, fighting against the bad things and building the good stuff, but also creating and challenging the budget and ensuring that there are budget line items and things like that that really build the future envisioning and the safety net for our communities. Because living in Texas, we see that the safety net is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Right, and basically, there's when we one of the worst laws that one of the worst immigration racial profiling laws is called SB4, and that's something that affects everybody, right? It affects everybody whether you are an immigrant or you're not. It affects people who are going. Who are trans or gender neutral, who are getting a new ID and can't get a new ID because our system is messed up and they have to wait for months and years just to get a new ID, right? It goes for our migrant and youth populations who don't have an ID in the first place, right? So it really takes power away and it gives power to people who are racially profiling and have major systemic issues with our communities. And part of my work, and why I love my work, is being able to be directly on the ground, is doing direct action, is doing mutual aid work, is doing civic engagement work. And by civic engagement, I don't mean just let's go vote on November or in May. Civic engagement is something like let's go vote and then let's meet up next week about this solution. Let's go vote and let's build a community garden. Let's go vote and do this other stuff, right? And really look at the root causes of why we're here in the first place. And so part of that, I think I saw it resonate yesterday in the conversation, right, is oftentimes we can't just start at you need to go vote or we need this fund, right? We have to really start before then and really connect people to the issue because sometimes people don't see themselves connected to immigration, to this SB4, racial profiling, to voting, right? And so part of our work of coming together and you know, earlier somebody said that the only definition that we have right now is summit, right? But that's the critical part of this work, is being able to come together and come in alignment and figure out some of these different spaces. And so that's kind of why I really enjoy spaces like this, because we're able to share and we're able to build. And coming from somebody who's always on the other side of the fence line, right, on the military side, I tell people I grew up at the end of the runway between two military bases. And that was the reality, right? And under me was contamination, around me was military bases. And so what we see is really what's around us, right? And organizing is what really gets us through. And so I'm gonna stop there because I think we have another questions, but I just wanted to introduce myself and our community.
Hi, Hi everyone, can everyone hear me? My name is Xochitl. I recently just found out where my name came from. I had a conversation with my mom, and she told me that she went to Xochimilco in Mexico with my father, and there was this indigenous lady that asked my mom, "Can I see the palm of your hand?" And my mom was like, "Sure, of course." And they told her, "Okay, you're pregnant, you have a girl, her name has to be Xochitl." So for me to know that, I was like, wow, like when I find a purpose in life, it's actually, it just brings me more connected to a collective effort, because I know that my purpose is not just for me, but it's for the next generation coming before me. And for me to understand that at such a young age is something very emotional for me, because I didn't want to be mad at the system that incarcerated me for being my mom's brown child. I wanted to actually go back into a system that uses a lot of militaristic tactics and strategies on young people. And for me to see that and educate myself and the roots of that was very concerning to me, and very confusing to me, because when I was 7 years old, CPS, which is a form of state violence, came into our family and disrupted us, and they took me away, and I went to a foster care home. And then, from 12 to 17, I was in and out the juvenile justice system. And, the system likes to label us. So we're fit into these carceral, systemic, militaristic strategy detention facilities that look like, different forms across the United States, really. And, throughout my childhood, I always had to be the second parent, because my dad, according to CPS, my dad, for 16 years, he has never been in my life. But recently, actually, 6 months ago, when he was fighting diabetes, and I offered him a home, because I wanted to be present into the movement. So, I got a job with Courage. I actually met Courage when I was incarcerated in a detention facility. And one thing that really brought me to them was really that they elevated youth voices, and mostly those closest to the problem, because they believe closest to the problem have this form of solution building that policymakers are very disconnected to. So I wanted to honor that identity, and I joined Courage, and I did some research, participatory research, and I started learning about policy. And one thing that I knew I really wanted to do is politicize the young people that were inside Alameda County's juvenile justice system, because I knew that there was a bigger issue going on, that a carceral system like a juvenile hall was stripping their identity from the young people that policymakers were benefiting from. And to me, I really wanted to address that by just creating my own curriculum, which is literally local social movements that young people can connect themselves to and recognize themselves to, so they know that their purpose is bigger than themselves as well. And I had a lot of pushback, actually, because I had a record, and we all know that having records and having these different policies are just a way of kind of disposing people and not making them valuable enough to be present in society as a collective, and using like these racial scripts that we often find ourselves comparing each other, but really we all fall under the same umbrella. So yeah, that's a little bit of what I do, and I'm just a little bit nervous, so excuse me if I turn red or if I'm like stuttering a little bit, but yeah, that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Sochi, and thank you to everyone for introducing yourselves. English is not my first language. I will stutter with you many times. Don't worry about it. So the next question, I think it's for many of us an important question around a lot of, especially Nana and Xochitl addressed the many ways in which systems of harm are so intertwined and sometimes are the reasons our communities are forced to migrate and are disposed of, right? We know in the organizing work we do that we have to divest really, really deeply from those systems, from the cup we have on our brain all the way to like really removing economically from those systems. And then there's the other side of like, well, if we wanna end those systems, what do we put in their place so that we can actually get our needs met, our safety needs, our health needs met, right? And so the question is, how does your organization and the organizing work that you do practice or addresses the framework of divesting from systems of harm and investing in systems of care in the communities you work with?
Okay, maybe I'll start. So we're
Thank
just
you.
going down the line. I was going to say, we'll go down the line this way, but it's okay. I'll start in the middle. So, as I indicated in the beginning, Baji's an abolitionist organization, and I should have said, really, we're an abolitionist feminist organization, which, you know, you can be a carceral feminist, so the abolition part is important to us. And it's something that we started in 2006. There's maybe not such a hard line of that in 2006, though we definitely were about closing down jails, prisons, etc. But, you know, it's like the language wasn't formed in the way that it is now. That's a better way to say it, right? And so, but in the language that we talk about now, we are a divest to the end, right? So what we actually want is for these systems not to exist at all. So we're the strange organization that's not calling for cops to be prosecuted because they've killed someone, because that means a jail will be still standing. That means a criminal sanction system will still exist, right? And that we know that there's harm that occurs in our communities because that is something that people do, right? So we know that that happens. And we stand firmly on the understanding that it is really, literally care and love that's gonna make the difference, right? And we know that from so many examples. So I'm gonna give an example that's not even a Baji example. I'm old as dirt and twice as funky. And so I was like in my 20s or something in 1992, living in Los Angeles, where I still live, when they had the rebellion. Right before the rebellion, on April 29th, 1992, there were different groups that were coming together of street organizations that some people call gangs, who had leaders within those groups who had decided that they actually didn't want to do this anymore, right? And so the police, with all of their horrible, terrible LAPD special units and who and what, who had managed to do nothing but terrorize and murder Black, brown, Asian, indigenous people, and had done not a drop of change in terms of what was happening with intercommunal violence. In less than a year, and I was one of the few women that was up in there trying to help folks come up with different, things on writing and all of that. In less than a year, but a hard year, people had developed an entire system that included every person in the community on how we were gonna move from the police coming in to doing it ourselves. And the police responded the way they always respond. Remember, they did the same thing in Baltimore after Freddie Gray was killed, when the brothers and sisters and siblings there said, we're not gonna fight anymore. The police immediately said, oh, they're doing that to kill us, and went after the leaders because they knew their jobs were over. That people were seeing clearly that, oh, actually, you don't do your gig, right? And we say it again and again and again, Uvalde, who and what. We have lots of examples. But that was an example that was so clear that what actually did something was care, was love, was the community putting resources there, but also demanding the government put resources. Because after 3 days of tearing this motherfucker up, they figured out that maybe they should put some money in the community, right? Now the danger, the part that happened that was dangerous, was that then people got co-opted. Because then the system was like, I can actually give you something better. I can give you a job with benefits. And then people, of course, you can't get, it's hard to get jobs with records, et cetera. So people were happy to be able to get that, which is the same thing that happens, to your earlier point, Kitzia, with the police. Tell me a job that you can get with the GED where you might make $200,000 to $300,000 a year with overtime, hella pensions, free everything. Get to go first in line at the airport, beyond the police and the military. This is why you see so many of our community members in those spaces, because they're so excluded from other spaces. Schools have the ROTC, schools have the police. It's a different school to police pipeline, right? All of that is happening because of what they have done to try to co-opt that and act like that is care, right? So a police officer because I care about the community. I'm a soldier because I care about our country and I want to protect it. And so that becomes the definition, instead of what we actually should be putting money into that really is going to show the care, right? That same cop, instead of being a violence worker, could be a care, right? A care member, right? That same soldier that instead of being a violence worker, that's all it is, you're just a worker. They don't care about you no more than any other worker up in here. Could be a care worker, right? So the humanitarian aid could be going to Haiti instead of taking over their government and planning to bring in a multinational police force, right? And so that's how we look at it. That's how we talk about it. We just recently came back from the UN, the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, and did a whole conversation about militarism and authoritarianism with Movement for Black Lives, CCR, the Southern Center for Human Rights, to talk about this. How do we do something different? And so that's the kind of work we're doing on a global scale, the nation scale, the scale of the state, and then down even to the city.
Thank you for sharing that. Through our lens and viewpoint, we talk a lot about a process or practice, a theory called just transition, right? And this is something we face from communities that have had high military bases, Military City, USA, San Antonio, Texas, at one point had 8+ military bases and went through a process of base realignment and closure act, right? So now, decades later, we're seeing this transformation of these spaces into kind of like city bases, right? But what we're facing is a different form of contamination, right? We're seeing inland ports, planes, trains, and trucks that support oil and gas industry, that support bioweapons, engineering, security. San Antonio for many years hosted what's called the Border Security Conference, which is a global conference of people trying to find new and innovative ways to kill us. And we see those being practiced in our communities here throughout the US, throughout the border, as well as basically any community, right? And so it's interesting to really be able to work towards something that we have to envision. And a lot of this work is visionary, right? We have to be able to envision something that's different and something that's a solution while processing and healing from all of our other traumas, right? As we grow up, as we face, as we travel, as we transition into different spaces. And I think that's the beauty of some of this work, and everybody in this room is that visionary point of saying there is something different. And we know the bad things, right? And we know the good things, but the fuzzy area, the gray area, the just transition area is where it falls, right? And so we ain't trying to transition to a new form of policing that looks like us, that talks like us, that feels like us, right? We understand that it's gonna take us something different, and it's gonna take moving away from those systems of policing and practice that our communities have faced for 500 plus years, especially coming from a location like ours where it's literally a conversation around land back. and a conversation around even simply creating safe spaces for people to have this conversation, for people to exist without having ICE, police have access to you, right? And that's something that comes from privilege and power, is like, I have access to schools, I have access to churches, I have access to, malls, city hall, and any government spaces. And what we're saying is, you will not have access to our community spaces.
That's right.
And that is something that we're taking control of. And when we talk about divesting from these forms of military, we're talking about taking ownership of our own spaces and communities, creating community gardens, creating community centers, creating autonomous spaces of healing where people can simply just exist without the fear of ICE coming, because we're having a meeting on SB4 and immigration and undocumentation, right? And that's what it goes down to, right? So investing, what that also means is investing in the things that people actually need. We could talk about policy, and sometimes that's a disconnect, but sometimes people just need a meal. Sometimes people just need a space to sit and access the internet so they could download the documents that they need for school. Sometimes that's all it needs to really engage people. And when we talk about investing, we talk about creating sort of those spaces where people could simply do what they need to do to continue the movement moving forward. And so we're just facilitators of this space, right? We're not owners, we're not policing the space. People can do what they need to do. And like becoming a parent, I notice a lot how entrenched policing is as a parent. Don't go there, don't touch that, don't do that. And part of it is like, how do we create spaces where people can do what they want to do and what they need to do, versus trying to control the things where we don't want people to do, right? And so part of movements and part of autonomous spaces, organizations, collaboratives, nonprofits, and everything else, the way people come together, is simply just creating a space for people to be and do what they need to do for their community on their own terms, in their own language, in their own space, sharing a meal, access to coffee, and a nice smile at the end of the day, right? And so that's a little bit about what we do. And we talk about investment. A lot of the times it's just resources to stay open 5 or 6 hours in the evening. Resources to stay open Saturdays and Sundays, resources for, art supplies and meeting spaces and things like that. And so investment in organizers so that we can be available to the communities that need the space to do what they need to do, for youth to gather and just play games. Sometimes it's politicized, yes, but sometimes they just want to gather without that policing force of being like, I could just be a child without having to be the translator for my parents, without having to take care of my kids, right? And so I think that's what we need to create more of and invest in. And that's why kind of a lot of us are in this space too, is saying that there's thriving spaces in our communities that are existent that just need a little bit of bump in resources and space so that we could actually do the things that we do on a larger scale. And that's what it means to divest, invest for us.
Absolutely.
That just makes me think about what Courage learned about closing youth prisons. So in the state of California, we closed down the Division of Juvenile Justice, formerly known as CYA. And oftentimes when we talk about closing something, the state's response is either giving them 60 to 30 to 90 days to fix it, or they change their names. So when we look back at it, we're like, oh, it's different. No, it's the same building. They just changed the name and probably more funded, right? So so it went from CYA to the Division of Juvenile Justice. According to Senate Bill 823, it closed down. And all the young people that were in there were supposed to go back to county care. So that was a win for us, right? We're like, okay, we closed down a juvenile prison, but what we learned from that was that we needed to build alternatives, and that actually goes back to that land back. So Courage, in this year, in June of 2024, we will be opening up the Oscar Grant Youth Power Zone, which we were actually able to purchase and really say, like, exactly what you said, like a space where young people are not labeled, where a space where I say young people and not youth, because young people, I'm expressing young people under like 25, because, we know the brain doesn't develop until, but we know that, we know that, right? So I try to like balance that out. But yeah, that was really important for us to know, where it was also culturally relevant to the population that often falls into the juvenile justice system, because looking at disparities, back to what Nana said, we know that the youth that are locked up are Black and brown people, males at a higher rate, and then when we look at gender disparities, we see 9 to 22 young women be incarcerated throughout a year. So why haven't we ended the incarceration of young women? Why haven't we built alternatives for them away from our carceral system? We know they're the mothers, we know they're the givers, we know they're the second parents, we know that they're often being pushed away as more overly labeled, that the juvenile justice system is like, we don't even know what to do with them anymore. And so I'm really excited for this building to come into fruition and actually open. And that actually also reminds me that when I think about, I know I hear you say like pensions and monetary gain to like be a participant in this carceral system. A lot, when I have conversations with the juvenile institution officers in JJC, like little sidebars, they know that they're Black, they know that they're Latina, they know that they're, they had an upbringing that wasn't, that was tokenized and this peripheral that I'm really like learning about. They tell me, I'm like, yeah, I've been doing this for 22 years, and I knew that this whole time, it's never been okay for me to lock up a young person. It's not okay. So for me to understand that the state removes a Black and brown person's identity for a state benefit, when you talk to those individuals, they'll tell you straight up, I know this is wrong, but what is the alternative? What are we supposed to do when young people are causing crimes? And we know that United States uses a crime control model, instead of looking at what indicators are in communities that actually uplift communities, have street lights on streets, right? We know that street lights reduces crime, making sure that schools are not underfunded, making sure that young people's voices are heard, and we have parent circles, and we have healing circles, and we have all these different prevention models, because the people locking up young people are saying, I know this is not right. I don't feel like this is right. So yeah, that's what we learned about alternatives and building a space and actually gaining that land back for young people. But something that I also want to call out is foster youth. We know the state is responsible for foster youth. So me and 12 others in 2021 to 2022, we actually asked the Board of Supervisors for $3.3 million for guaranteed income for young people aging out of foster care. Because if you already harmed young people for so many years and they're aging out of foster care, like, where are the resources for them? Where is the safety net? Like, the state just wants us to automatically think that we are, as young people, are just gonna figure it out because they, for some reason, did something right. But no, like, when the state has control, I put my critical race theory hat on, and I'm like, there's some type of interest convergence here, because the young people themselves are saying, I'm aging out of, I'm disqualified because my qualification does not fit in this policy that says that Medi-Cal can only take care of mental health in foster youth until their age of 21. Like, what the hell is that? Like, I don't even get that. So we actually won. We actually got the money that we needed. So for 2 years in Alameda County, young people will receive $1,000 for when they age out, so they can have some form of safety net. And when we looked at like some participatory research that me and the 12 other former foster youth did, a lot of young people didn't understand their identity into the whole social part, because they've been trying to figure out themselves for so long. So we know that young people need money in their pockets, and we know that we need land back, and we know that participants that are in these carceral system are saying themselves that they need alternatives themselves.
Thank you.
So many threads, and so many things I wish we could get into. But I think that what's shared among the different experiences is that the reality of organizing in this political landscape is that it's still extremely dangerous to be Black and brown, advocating for social justice, our rights, human rights, land rights, whatever it may be. And how these systems have worked to create those conditions by either criminalizing us, calling us terrorists, passing new laws that make it hard for us to be able to organize in the way that we need to do in our communities, or even making it illegal to invest in the type of development that we need in our communities. And then, through the practice that we see right now with Palestine, like naming pro-Palestinian supporters as terrorists, which is not new as well, or even through extrajudicial killing, which still happens here in the United States and not something that happens in third world countries. And that is the landscape that we're organizing in now. So when we think about, and when Indian works to do this stuff about this work around divestment and investment, it literally is like I said, the pillar of how we do our work: defend, develop, and decolonize. And it brings me so much joy to hear people repeat the framework of land back, because that is the core of our movement and the indigenous rights movement in general. But it's not just about fighting for land back. It's about being the people that the land also wants back.
Right.
And that's a sacred responsibility, and it's a responsibility rooted in a fierce concept of love, of understanding and honoring our relationship to one another and to non-human life, and how that needs to inform our movements going forward. Some of the stories that y'all shared were resonating with me. I'm we got examples too, in so many different ways. Indigenous children are disproportionately taken and put into foster care systems. It was only until we got the Indian Child Welfare Act that we achieved somewhat the right to get our children returned back to our communities, but that consistently remains under threat. I'm not sure how many people know about the reign of terror that took place in the 60s and 70s with COINTELPRO, the FBI, and CIA bringing waves of extraordinary violence into our indigenous communities to combat the American Indian movement, and how we are still fighting for our longest held political prisoner, Leonard Peltier, who is now an elder, and who on June 10th is facing his last opportunity for parole. And these are the conditions that we're fighting, I think, and the ways that we are being forced to fight, these are intentional. It is meant to overwhelm us and to keep us in a state where we are constantly, we're constantly on the defense. We're overwhelmed with all of the battles that are before us, to the point where it's intended to either nullify our movements or to assimilate us and make us feel like there's no other way. And so the need to learn from the different divestment strategies is critically important. One of the movements that Indian Collective was birthed from was the movement at Standing Rock. And in that work, the effort to organize around getting companies and organizations to divest from pipelines was a core part of trying to battle and win that battle. But what we learned in that process was okay, when we were successful, those moments when we were successful from moving divestment from out of pipelines, it just went right back into another extractive industry. It just went right back into another harmful, violent industry, either in surveillance or in policing or militarization and weaponry, or in extraction for renewable energy projects. And so the lens is so important. The political analysis that we use when we're doing this work is so important, and doing both the defense as well as the creating the spaces and taking back the stolen wealth and rematriating it to our communities to be able to dream and to build the solutions that they want for their communities goes hand in hand. And that's because we're working for a paradigm shift. And if we're just constantly in the defense, then our solutions will only be defined by improving the incremental change that these institutions are willing to give us. And that just wastes our time. Like I heard several of our panelists speak, we want to dismantle these things. Yeah. We want them to cease to exist. From the institutions of power to the colonial borders. That is how we build our liberation. That is how we liberate our peoples. And our liberation is tied to the liberation of the land. And so we have to be very careful when we're given frameworks like the just transition that are meant to organize and bring intersectionality into a movement to shift from one harmful form of extraction into a better way that is still defined largely by securing profits and controlling wealth and controlling peoples and territories, because that's not a just transition. And when we talk about from an indigenous perspective, what we're looking for, what we're seeking just transformation. And the way that's defined is the justice and the ability and the freedom to restore a wholeness to ourselves and to our lands. And that's why at Indian Collective, we know that when we invest in those solutions and when we invest in the self-determination of the indigenous peoples, that's how it leads to better outcomes for all peoples and the planet. And so we carry on in that way.
No.
Oh, it was just delayed. Wow. My comrades are loving, fierce, brilliant. Aren't they? Yeah. We have half an hour left. But before we keep going, I want to invite you to close your eyes for a moment. We talk about this at GGJ. We have an amazing mentor, Sandra Moran, who talks about this idea of sentipensar, thinking by feeling. And we just got so many stories and visions for land back, for liberation, for repurposing our own values of care towards justice and away from what they've been co-opted. And we know that visions for an abolitionist future and a future where we thrive are born through practice. And so you just heard a bunch of things about how that practice happens. So then imagine yourself in that practice too. You're probably already practicing. And if not, imagine yourself so that when you open your eyes, you will be more committed to it than before. And with that being said, I'm gonna collapse two questions into one. You can open your eyes if you want. So we already talked about feminism in many ways, and I wanted to express that the word feminism is a contested terrain, and that we don't all have the same definition in this room. But I want to offer the definition of Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, which is grassroots feminisms in plural. And why plural? Because we actually have a plurality of visions for the world we want to see in this room and in this very panel, from Black abolitionists, right, to rematriation and indigenous resistance, to really looking at what it looks like to be transforming our communities away from militarism into a community where people can literally be what they want to be, as Diana said. So my questions is looking forward and like doing the forward-looking thinking around the world we want to see. How do you apply both the framework of feminist abolition, and how do we continue to build movements where our visions where we face the compounding crises that Diana was talking about, but we are also facing the visions of the future that we need for our people to thrive and to grow well and to be in right relationship with Mother Earth and the land.
Yeah, wow, thank you for that question. So we know, as I learned and I've spoke, name changing is always going to happen. When that's a way that systems become stronger and systems are being fed by monetary gains or monetary state gains. And I learned that as I keep walking inside this juvenile facility on Thursdays and on the weekends, I think about often like burnout, you know, I think about burnout. So I have to make sure that my space at home is always taken care of, and I'm constantly breaking those cycles as myself. And I mentioned like my dad hasn't been in my life for 16 years until recently, and my mom and my dad's from Mexico, Oaxaca, and he came to the United States through the Bracero program, where the U.S. Was asking Mexicans to come to California and actually do and work in the lands, and then later they're like, okay, we don't need you no more, we're going to try to send you back. And my mom in El Salvador, where they believe mass incarceration, right? We know that in El Salvador, the president right now has just built one of the biggest prisons that we know. So I learned, you know, I can't be mad at these systems, but through a feminist lens, is show care, community, and forgiveness. And when I go into these juvenile facilities, that's what I show the young people, and I coach them up. You know, I think coach up is the next thing moving forward, especially for Courage. We host events in juvenile hall. It's so hard just organizing and coordinating events in juvenile hall because their thinking is just so militaristic, so carceral, so punitive, that oftentimes I have to find myself always into that intergenerational space where I'm like really trying to tell somebody that's in position of leadership that approves, you know, the theme, approves the dancers, approves all these different forms of that come in a component of event that are coming from young people. Young people are saying like, I want this, I want that, and you know, so just seeing that, you know, so just be ready for that when you're trying to go into a system that's trying to sustain itself. And one thing moving forward too is that there's a garden in back of JJC, and when I got locked up there the last time when I was 17, I planted a lemon tree there. And when I went back, I actually cried back to that lemon tree because it was actually growing and it's fruiting lemons, you know? So one of the things that Courage does is that we have community gardens because when you're in a city that there's so much violence, gunshots, a lot of homelessness, and we're in the flats, like we know that rarely do young people get out of the city. And when you talk to them and you ask them, when was the last time you took a trip? When was the last time you were able to see greenery and connect yourself back to those ancestral roots? They'll say like never, you know? So one of my goals is really trying to connect young people to their roots. And even if it's at JJC, I know that it's like we're trying to like starve the beast. And I think when you allow young people to see themselves beyond like their circumstances, they won't return back into a system that has harmed them. They'll actually turn to us and say, and we're actually the safety net for these young people, but there has to be some type of like process for them to see themselves into this movement, because when they're released, they're again on survival mode. We know that probation is not community. They're a state surveillance conditions. So we have to make sure that, well, one of my duties is that as I go inside, that they're not coming back into a system that is gonna harm their children, and hopefully, you know, with Oscar Grant Power Zone, that it'll keep those young people away from that. So that's what's moving forward for Courage and for me.
one of the things that I think about when I think about grassroots feminism, and I think my SWU is part of a founding member of Grassroots Global Justice. And we're really proud of that because it's really entrenched in a lot of our work. And one of the things that we reflect in is that many of the times we are the ones who are also the main caretakers for our families. So as we're leading movements in our organizations and in these positions, we also have to change our own organizing systems to ensure that our own families are cared for. And I think that's something that's in practice. I think GGJ and a lot of grassroots movements have really put at the center, is ensuring that there is that care and health piece to every one of gatherings and conferences. And I think for me, that's awesome, because I then have to go home and continue to do this work, right? And it does feel never ending, and I think that's why these systems and the work that we're talking about when we talk about the ecosystems of our organizations and our movements ensures that there is that collaborative structure, that there is that web and that networking of backups and backup systems and people who we could rely on. And a lot of that is, the root of that is relationship building. And I know we've talked about this for 30 plus years in environmental justice movements, right? But relationship building is at the core. And unfortunately, that's very hard for funders to fund. And part of it is us being able to push that, is that the way we transform our communities is by relationship building, is by showing up at people's workplace, by showing up at where people are, at schools, at churches, at bus stations, and talking to people directly. And being able to say, this isn't working, people aren't coming to the meetings. Why aren't they coming to our meetings? Because they're working, right. Because they're caring for their families, right? So how do we create spaces where people could do both, right? And how do we transform our own movements and our own nonprofits for those that are in positions of power to ensure that there is that system and web of care for long-term organizing? And I think that's something that, to the core of grassroots feminism, is also what we call, GGJ calls it, I think something different, but we call it comadre economies, right? Is, off of just a monetary exchange, is barter, trade, the way our systems and our traditional systems of community functioned, right? Is comadre economies, being able to do new systems and structures and skills. We also do domestic worker organizing, and part of their push is we like to learn something different, because the only thing that we could do here right now is clean wealthy people's homes. And that's what people see us as forever. So we'd like to change our own vision and our own future to ensure that we're sharing skills and we're sharing knowledge so that people could be something different that they were labeled. And so part of what I think of those systems is sort of a well-rounded ecosystem. We talk about ecosystem as our, as our environment, and we part of our environment. But for us, each of our organizations has an ecosystem that also needs to be strong, and that also needs to have care, and needs to give people time off, and needs to web in family and food, and all these different things that make us happy, because that's the way that our movement could continue to work, and that's how we battle things like burnout, even things like what we think about when we think about our movements, right? I come from a traditional Chicano movement, right? And a lot of that was you have to be the one who talks the longest at the end of the meeting to win, right? You have to be the one that talks the loudest and the longest, and therefore your theory is the one that's gonna move forward, right? And there's at a certain point where it's I don't want to do that. That's not the way I want to engage with my community through this power over versus a power with, right? And so we as people need to also change that narrative of how movements and nonprofits and organizations come together to say, we need to step back at a certain level, and we need to change the course and the practices that, we've seen in the past, because oftentimes that gets people feeling back. If they're the shy ones, they're never going to be in the front because they're afraid to function in this system that oftentimes says if you're not the loudest, you're not the strongest. And I think that's not a good way of seeing, because every one of us has a value, whether we're speaking up or not, whether we're in the room or not. And I think as a grassroots feminism's movement sees people as not just as a person or a tab or a statistic, but sees people as part of an ecosystem and as part of our web. And I think that's, for me, an important part of how we're transforming movements and how we're really transforming the way that we can exist for long-term organizing and that community change that we've all been envisioning.
Right.
Oh, I thought
we're going down the line, okay. I'm like, are we doing a line or a popcorn? So I'm gonna plus all that's been said and focus on 2, maybe 3 things. So I think the first thing that we work on as Baji, in addition to some of the threads that and pieces that were laid at the altar by the compass before me, one is helping our folks or working with our folks to envision what it is that they want to see, how it is that they want to live, what it is that they want to, how they want the world to be. And then having conversations about how do we love ourselves to that, right? How do we, using love, care, joy, how do we get to that point? So we're not going to get to that point by punishing people, disciplining people, yelling at people. How do we love ourselves to that, right? Which for a lot of people, they have not necessarily thought about that because, whether it's our cultures or, our religions, like everything is really about how you punish people. And, my father used to tell me, pressure makes the diamond and friction makes the pearl. And I was like, well, I just want to be a person. I'm not trying to be a diamond or a pearl. I don't know why that sounds exciting. Neither one of those sound good to me. But that is how we're trained to function, right? And so thinking in that way, so that's the first. The second is really centering the most vulnerable of people. It becomes easier when you are vulnerable. And when you see, when you become a vulnerable person or see yourselves or understand your vulnerabilities, you kind of fall into it. I'm partially blind, makes it a lot easier for me to see how it's a problem to be partially blind in this world. Much easier than when I was just wearing, Coke bottle glasses, right? But how do we do that consistently without having to be in that situation ourselves, right? To think of who are the most vulnerable, whether it be the criminalized, the undocumented, queer folks who have disabilities, whoever the folks are, right? Who are the most vulnerable, the people that don't have as many voices, the people with the softer voices, right? Who are the people who are the most vulnerable? And then how do we center them, but not just in the conversation that we're having in the meeting, but what we're doing in the room, right? So walk with me a little bit. I have this mask on. Do you think I just don't understand that it's easier to breathe without a mask? I have this mask on because I thought we were told we were at this feminist abolitionist space and we're supposed to be protecting one another. So I brought a mask. And I brought a bunch of other masks too. I got some. I can hand them out. But they have masks downstairs, upstairs, right? Why? Even if I think I'm okay and that I can go through 12 rounds of COVID, fortunately, knock on wood, I haven't gotten it yet. But even if I think I can do that, and even if I'm sure someone else in here can do that, there's someone in here that cannot actually afford to get COVID, right? Yes. Or the flu, or a common cough, because they have one lung that just didn't put a sign on their head that said, I have one lung, right? And so if we're centering the most vulnerable amongst us, and there's a mask on every floor, what Baji teaches us is we pick up that mask. And we put that mask on our face, and we take time sometimes to go outside so we can gulp for air, so that we make sure that we are living what we say we believe in. Because if we can model this, now we are the ones that are supposed to know, right? So then we can go and speak amongst all of our community members, and they can see that, Nana models that. So now it got to the point that, even with, folks that are with Baji members, Baji staff, they be walking around without any masks. Nana walk in the room, some people with masks walk in the room, they're like, oh, they reach in their bag, right? Because they just forget, it's okay, right? It's all right, it's not a dramatic experience. But it's something that we're trying to get folks to just practice, to remember that we're wearing the mask not just so we don't get sick. We're wearing the mask because we don't know who in here is vulnerable, right? And we model that, and that's how that then becomes a standard where it doesn't have to be a pandemic that kills over 1 million people in the United States and however many millions of people around the world before we understand that we literally share the same air.
Centering our most vulnerable. I absolutely want to uphold that, and holding that with tenderness in the way that it's not an invitation to start Oppression Olympics, which I know has been one of the problems that have created tensions between social movements and building cross-sectional solidarity. And in that way, it brings me to, I guess, one of the main points in how, as Indigenous peoples, we organize and we see our battle, is that we're not just fighting systems, that we're ultimately in a spiritual battle. At its core, we are in a spiritual battle fighting against a culture of violence. And the antidote to that is a culture of love and of care. And so as we look forward from this moment, I know from our lens, yes, to all the things of what we should be divesting and investing in. But I think another thing that we need to invest in is decolonization and what that means in practice. From an Indigenous feminism, we come from the lens that we've all been conditioned to normalize the values and ideology of white supremacy and heteronormative patriarchy, and that this harms all genders.
That's right.
And so our task, when we think about at its core what decolonization means, it means the dismantling of these systems. It means taking an abolitionist framework. It means investing in a community of care, but it also means restoring the sense and understanding of the divine masculine and the divine feminine in all genders and in our relationships to each other. And so at this moment, I think what we're being called to and witnessing a genocide being played out in real time and hearing the echoes of genocides that are still invisibilized, that are being carried out simultaneously. We're being asked, right now, how do we harness that and address the historical trauma that this brings up, and harness also the historical resiliency and strength that we also inherit, and take that to be able to face and hold and not look away from what's happening, but to hold the grief and the rage and the exhaustion and transform it into something like a politics, an action, a movement building strategy that's rooted in fierce love that honors our kinship with one another. Because ultimately we're fighting to restore our sense of humanity and the responsibilities that we have for our own sacred life and for the sacred life that everyone holds and that exists all around us. I think this is the way that we can maybe find those strategies that helps us cut through the chaos, confusion, the disinformation, the manufactured divide, or the limited political lens that is meant to continue to prevent class, race, and international solidarity. Because our lives depend upon it. Our earth depends upon it. Our children, our students right now depend on us doing that. And our future generations depend on us doing that as well. And so I think that that's the call to action now. That's the movement that I know I want to be a part of. I know that's the movement that makes our heart and our spirits feel good. And I hope that we can get there. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Nana referred to an altar earlier. And really this brilliant panel has been about honoring the fact that we believe in relationships and sustaining relationships. And that is what social power is about, relationships that can last a long time and in which we can wield our mobilizations, our exercises of building those gardens and sustaining them, our capacity to work on gang truces, our capacity to be resilient and heal and face the crisis as we heal. So the altar, right? The altar is lemon trees and political educations for system-impacted people, comadre economies, and movement babies. The altar is loving ourselves to our visions, centering the most vulnerable, and fashion-matching masks. The altar is tenderness, spiritual culture, and of love and care, decolonization, and holding the grief that we need to hold so that we can transform it into fierce love. So thank you so much for that altar offering.
Thank you, Kitzia.